This story now, the SACP has recently launched its Red October campaign focusing on land and food. The ANC-led tripartite alliance is experiencing difficulties, with some COSATU affiliates accusing the governing party of abandoning workers. Now, at COSATU's 14th National Congress in Midrand, ANC chairperson Gwede Mantashe was refused an opportunity to address the Congress. To talk more about this and other related issues, we're joined by the SACP's General Secretary, Mr. Solly Mapaila. Mr. Mapaila, good morning and thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting us.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Quite a lot to talk about. You've just returned from Cuba, and we just saw the Union General Assembly actually voted, and it is again for the 30th time voting in favor to actually end the embargo. Your take on that? I mean, the fact that it's been 6 decades of that embargo.
The embargo is the most devilish and atrocious act of government imposed on a country by the United States because they just don't like socialism next door. And I think its impact on the Cuban people is huge. It has refused that country to grow economically because they punish other countries that trade with Cuba. They have to pass special acts of Congress, for instance, the Helms-Burton Act, which prohibits any other person to trade with Cuba if that person has intentions to trade with the USA. I think this is one of the most atrocious. It's actually genocidal.
And they've sustained it for 30 years. One wonders then, can it continue in this fashion? Because the only people that reject it is the US, supported by Israel. We've seen Romania at one point. We also had Brazil in 2019 under Bolsonaro. But generally, they are the only two. So can it continue in this way because there's a vote, but nothing happens?
Well, it also shows the uselessness of the institutions, multi-government institutions like the UN, which has over the years not acted in defense of the people in poor countries, but has only acted in defense of interests of the G8 countries, or the top industrialized countries and the most powerful. But overall, these are institutions that sometimes we keep our hopes on, with the belief that we can end the powerfulness of big institutions and have a sense of unity, even as commonality amongst nations. But it doesn't happen, like as you indicate. Despite this, many a times the UN takes this decision. The US is not forced to implement it, but other countries that trade with the US cannot actually even quote this UN decision because this is not a UN sanctions. It's the US sanctions.
And I love the wording. I actually looked at your statement in support, which was ahead of the UN General Assembly vote. You had deliberately called it or termed it a blockade, not an embargo. And the Americans insist it is an embargo. The term blockade means that Cuba cannot trade with other countries. But you're saying that, well, technically, they still can't trade with other countries in as much as they say it's just an embargo.
No, it's a blockade. I mean, the Helms-Burton Act, for instance, there was a time when a Cuban student won an international award of the UN, UNHCR, for instance. And in that particular award, he won a computer, a laptop. But the program in the laptop was from Microsoft, which is an American company. So they prohibited the UN from handing over the laptop to a Cuban student because it says a US product. That's the extent, not even products. So it's a blockade. It's not an embargo. It's more than an embargo. It's a blockade. In fact, Trump, as he left office, passed more than 240 new acts or regulations against Cuba, which this sleeping Joe Biden had continued with it. So this is just absolute condemnation of a country to prove that the US is powerful. But nonetheless, Cuba had survived and continues to survive. Its socialist system remains quite strong and is able to try under these difficult conditions. For instance, recently it has had a huge Hurricane Ian, that devastated the country, particularly in the south of Cuba. But it still exists. There's still a survive. Few countries that trade with it who are not intimidated by the US, like China, Russia, and a few others.
Continue to trade with it.
Yes, of course, yeah.
But when we look at the numbers, just in 1992, with the first vote, we had probably the abstentions exceeding the number of those who voted yes for the embargo to be lifted, or the blockade, as you would term it, for the blockade to be lifted. But over the years, we've seen a decrease in the abstentions. Many people now being firm in the position that it must be lifted. But some are saying we need to be careful. We shouldn't misinterpret the number of people, nations voting yes, to mean that they have picked a position as to who was an aggressor between Fidel Castro and President Dwight in 1960, that they are not saying who would have been the aggressor in that instance. They're merely saying that they hate the impact of that embargo or blockade on the citizens of Cuba.
Not even that. I mean, if you look into, firstly, it was J.F. Kennedy who issued an attack on Cuba with the Bay of Pigs invasion, which wanted to destroy the newly established socialist system there, because immediately Fidel and his team embarked on land transformation. It took Cuba 53 days,
reforms, yes.
53 days to make land reform, which we have been struggling for 2 decades here. When they did that, transferred land to the people of Cuba, to the peasants, to the workers, the oligarchs in the land sector ran to America.
So they were not compensated for their land.
They were not compensated. Yeah, because it was taken over to the people. So President Kennedy then sent a team, military invasion actually, which were defeated. So as a consequence of defeat at the Playa Girón, resulted in then the Americans then imposing a complete, at the time they called the embargo, but it actually became a full blockade.
They started with the quota on sugar.
Yes,
and
they
then from
started
the
with
sugar,
many others. And
when you had Cuba deciding to rely on the Soviet Union, then came the oil.
Yeah, every other thing else followed until it is now what we call a complete blockade, because they've blockaded any trade with Cuba. Take your ship to Cuba today, 6 months it won't touch American waters. Yes.
Can't dock for 6 months.
Yeah. It's unacceptable.
But it's honestly...
But the so-called a country that claims to be the most democratic and has values of freedom, it doesn't have.
But they maintain that for those who trade with Cuba, you are actually perpetuating what happened to American businesses there, where everything was nationalized that belonged to them, be it the oil refineries, the banks. So they're saying you're participating in that type of crime.
Look, firstly, Cuba has long paid whatever debt that the U.S. may think it has had with them, whichever debt it is. But nonetheless, we should always know that America since 1904 had occupied a portion of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. Even to date, they have not exited it. They owe Cuba a lot of resources. They have not paid a cent out of that. At that time, they are still paying the rates that they decided by themselves way back over a century ago. And this is accrued into billions, which they can't pay back to a country that they've impoverished. So they're helping to impoverish because they refuse it to trade. But nonetheless, Cuba has developed high-level scientific areas, for instance, medication. They have one of the best medication, for instance, against sugar diabetes. They don't amputate people like we do here in this country. We can use that medication, but bureaucrats in this government do not want to use that medication, and yet they are amputating our people. In fact, the Communist Party is planning a campaign, a class action against government. If, for instance, they will continue to amputate our people when there's available medication and they can't access that medication precisely because they fear America. We're a sovereign state. We should have access to that medication and stop amputating our people from sugar diabetes or from the effects of sugar diabetes.
Quite a lot to talk about when it comes to Cuba and our relationship with them. But let's bring it back home. You've got Red October, the main rally happening this weekend. Talk to us about that under the theme Land, Food, Work. Why this theme?
We are responding to the social crisis, socio-economic crisis our country is facing today. There's a food crisis. There's hunger in our country. Our people cannot afford basic meals. Like you and me, for instance, we can afford, we are assured of having a meal a day. Others are struggling on a daily basis. There's huge unemployment, which has reached crisis proportion. The capitalist system has failed dismally to respond to the social needs, economic needs of our country, the government, on the one hand, has been pandering to the interest of capital, and as a result is not able to come with projects responding to this crisis, which is deepening. When we talk to the youth, for instance, it even goes to almost 70% of our young people, particularly African youth, that are unemployed. This is a major crisis for us. So we want to create a situation where the people can not only look into government for job creation, but they can look at themselves and see if they can have sustainable livelihoods mechanisms and other employment mechanisms, and build their own economy and survive, rather than look into a capitalist economy which doesn't care about them. As you know, at some point even the president was quite confused, actually even saying that government do not create jobs.
They create an enabling environment for the private sector.
I mean, that's complete misreading of his responsibilities. For instance, even the manifesto of the ANC talks to job creation, for instance, in many other sectors, which he should create. He has a policy mandate that he should utilize to make sure that there's job creation, build the capacity of the state or public sector creation of jobs.
Speaking of the president, yesterday he was in Parliament answering questions. And if we talk about jobs right now, how or what is your view on their handling of the just transition? Because yesterday, IFP member Naren Singh got up and said, he asked the president, are there going to be conditions that are put in place for new entrants into the cleaner energy? To say, you guys have got to upskill those that will lose their jobs in the coal-fired power stations. But then it got me wondering that, does it only become a responsibility for the new entrants, or it must also be a responsibility for the coal mines now to say you've got to reskill or actually outskill, which is to skill them in something completely different to that, be it welding, be it somebody going into bricklaying, whatever the case may be, because some of them don't have skills. But if at some point we must prepare for this eventuality of us doing away with the dirtier form of energy, then clearly there should be some preparation. Do you believe enough is being done to prepare for that eventuality?
Firstly, let's indicate the fact that South Africa has enough coal. Okay. Europe, that has said we must drop our coal, it's now using coal. We are transporting coal every single day in millions of tons to Europe. The countries that say we must not use coal are actually importing our coal and using it.
Yes.
We need to use our coal to secure our energy security. We're in an energy crisis. So we appreciate the fact that coal has a huge impact on the environment. But the capitalist countries have destroyed the environment using this coal to develop themselves. Now we are underdeveloped. They want to put the burden of development to us that they have created.
So you are saying they've created their industries on the back of this coal?
Yes.
And when it's our turn to build
When it's our turn to actually look after our people, they say, no, we will fund you for the transition. We have no problem with them funding the transition. But it must not come at the cost of us not having energy. We have an energy crisis now. We need to look into any possibility for cleaner sources of coal technologies and so forth.
The president says it's quite expensive.
No. They've always rebucked things that are in our hands. We have coal that can last us over 300 years. So the bottom line is how to use it effectively. At the same time, how to plan for the transition. Because, for instance, the policy is being driven by European countries. They say, for instance, over the next 10 years or so, they will not be able to use any product that was produced by coal-powered energy. So they force everyone to do what they want. We can look into multidimensional approaches to this thing, for instance, make sure that local use of energy can remain with coal in our situation. And then for the industrial use, in some instances, those that will largely be for export and so forth, can then be used in the field of renewables. But renewables at the moment cannot be the base load to guarantee energy security for our country. So it's foolhardy for government to simply jump into that space without doing its own needs analysis and requirements over a long term. But we are also for the safety of the environment, because it is the capitalists themselves that have destroyed our environment because of their rapacious way of production. In pursuit of profit, capitalism doesn't care. It destroys everything, nature and everything. After it has destroyed that, it wants all of us as human beings to take responsibility for its actions. So we have to reach a stage where we have to be independent, but take responsibility for the common being of protection of nature.
Still on the president, there is the panel now that's looking into Phala Phala. There's this conversation that should it be found that there is a prima facie case for the president to answer, he should step aside even though there is no particular case or criminal case currently against him. What is the SACP's view on this?
Well, the SACP has supported the step-aside policy of the ANC, which we felt was important to rein in a runaway corruption and runaway misbehavior of leaders of the movement. So we've supported that in that context. I mean, we have seen people who are charged with serious crimes, who have stolen money from the poor, who still compete to be leaders of the ANC. Despicable. This should not be happening because of the history of the ANC, what it has stood for, what it has done over the decades, that it has stood for the people of this country, sacrificed for the people of this country, had many of its cadres who died in the front line fighting for the freedom that we're enjoying today, which has now been contaminated by actions of misbehavior, corruption, and criminality, even amongst its leaders. It's unthinkable that
but it's
we could even
attached to
be
a
debating
charge. In most instances, the step aside applies to when there's a criminal case against you.
Yes, of course. In this
so
case,
in this instance, there is none. But some people are saying the unintended consequence of the step aside is that wayward conduct or conduct that brings the party into disrepute that isn't attached to a case number at the police station, then somehow is ignored. That Rule 25 of the ANC's constitution that must deal with ill discipline and suspend others is now rendered something that is somewhat useless because everybody now is more focused that if there's a case number, then you must step aside. But if there's none, you're seeing a lot of people, the Florence Radzilanis, if there's no case number attached to it, you're not stepping aside. If it's Zizi Kodwa and some are saying the amounts that he got from EOH are regrettable, that conduct there does bring the party into disrepute. But if it doesn't have a case number, now the African National Congress has forgotten that you still have Rule 25 to even discipline those where there's no case. Do you see that perhaps it is an unintended consequence here?
Well, it is made by the faction that is in charge that decides on who to protect and who not to protect, which is quite unfortunate. Because the step aside, in my understanding, sought to further re-elevate the ANC's moral authority and leadership of society. And in this case, you can see there's moral crisis inside the leadership of the ANC. The ANC has now been used as a tool of positions in government, a tool of prestige in society, which shouldn't be, because the ANC is an organization of service. But now, I think the dominant faction today, quite clearly disappointing, because it came on the mandate of correcting things. And I think that the moral leadership of President Ramaphosa has been tainted heavily because of this Phala Phala matter. And I think quite clearly he has not demonstrated good leadership on handling this matter. We had raised this matter with him as the party to try and understand, because whatever happens with his leadership affect the alliance. He's the leader of the totality of all of us in government. He represents the alliance in government. So it's quite unfortunate that this thing has dragged for too long and has not been resolved.
And affects you as alliance partners and your credibility.
Yes, of course.
Because in 2017, I'm listening to you now, you sound as how you sounded in 2017, building up to Nasrec. You had a lot to say about the president then, who was President Jacob Zuma. You were very disappointed as the SACP. You are now sitting almost saying the very same thing.
Yes.
In 2022.
Yes,
what does it mean for the SACP?
The SACP has to chart its own path. And I think our Congress was clear about this matter. We would have to mobilize the working class in our country to be more independently assertive in communities, not to allow bureaucratic entangling as much as political entangling with the ANC, whilst at the same time reaffirming our own right as members of the ANC, because the alliance is based on the principle of a dual membership. So the dual membership has not ended, so our members have full right to participate in the ANC, but independently as the Communist Party, we need to be quite clear. We shouldn't be associating ourselves with wrongdoing, embrace wrongdoing for whatever intentions that it may have for us, whether it's appointment into government office or anywhere else. It should not be. We should be driven by the interest of the working class. The interest of the people, of the poor, and we should remain critical and raise our voice where, for instance, government is not doing well, even if it's the government that we are part of.
And then just in closing, you guys are supporting Lungelo Lethu on their class action suit, 60 billion that they're suing banks in South Africa for, and that's for the repossession of people's homes that were sold for a pittance. Talk to us about that, because many say it's long overdue. It even happens in the car industry, where you pay your car for a long time, and then when you default almost at the end, then your car is sold for next to nothing.
Yes, we have raised this campaign. Firstly, we appreciate the comrades at Lungelo Lethu, Comrade Kinsibia. That's the South African that should be given a top award. Last, he won a major case against the banks with what we call the reserve price, wherein if the banks were to sell your house, when you were owing, you have paid it for 15 years, you are left with 5 years, you lose a job or whatever reason, if they sell that house, they must sell it at a market price and only take what is owed to them and give you the remaining. But they've been selling their houses, evicting people, and people will still owe them. So a major victory for us.
Some properties for 100 rand.
Yes, they sold some for 10 rand. We had a joint campaign with Lungelo Lethu where we were showing off how they were doing it. And I think South Africa, because the banks have got too much money, they quickly divert the media attention from this, and people continue to suffer. But we appreciate the work that we have done together with Lungelo Lethu, but largely to the comrades in Lungelo Lethu, who have also suffered greatly because they were intimidated by the criminal associations of banks who sent people to intimidate them, who wanted to kill them. We had at some point even protected Comrade King.
We spoke to him.
Yes, of course. So the bottom line now is that we support this class action that they've taken against the banks. It's very, very important. But where has been government all these years? We have been raising these matters. The bottom line is that our ministers, majority of them, are afraid of big capital, and it's quite disappointing. Ministers of Finance, Ministers of Trade and Industry, completely cowards, afraid of the banks. And this has to come to an end, because the people have elected government to act, and government cannot always protect the interest of the bourgeoisie, in this case financial capital, the banks. They've ill-treated our people in every way possible. Evidence has been there. Some of the houses have been sold for 10 rand in the past. And they go and buy in bulk. You find that one of the big banks will go and buy this month. It's their auction time. They buy 4,000 houses for 10 rand each or for 100 rand each. They put them at the market price. But what people do not know is that in some instances, they will also, as they take away your house, they also activate insurance to pay off that house.
No, it's a serious syndicate. Mr. Mapaila, I wish we had more time with you. Good luck this weekend on that main rally. Thank you very much. That's SACP's Solly Mapaila.